Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I brought some heavy hitters in here with me today. Today marks 1 month of President Trump's return to the Oval Office, and there is no denying this administration is off to a historic start. The president has already signed 73 executive orders. That is more than double the number signed by Joe Biden and more than quadruple the number signed by Barack Obama over the same period. These executive orders have ended burdensome regulations, sealed the border, unleashed our domestic energy sector, eliminated divisive DEI from our federal government, stopped the weaponization of government, cut waste, fraud, and abuse, reinstituted America First trade and foreign policies, and ultimately restored common sense. The president also signed the Lake and Riley Act into law, which ensures ICE will detain illegal aliens arrested or charged with.
In the February 20th, 2025 White House press briefing, the press secretary and senior officials highlighted what they called a historic first month of Trump's return to office. They touted executive orders eliminating DEI policies, sealing the border, cutting regulations, and reinstating the death penalty. On foreign policy, they claimed Trump is bringing peace to Ukraine through negotiations with Putin and Zelensky, while insisting that European nations should bear more of the financial burden. However, the idea that Trump alone can end the war ignores the reality that Russia was the aggressor, and forcing Ukraine into concessions would only reward Putin's invasion. The claim that Europe is not doing enough is also misleading, as EU nations have provided substantial aid. Critics argue that this approach risks undermining Ukraine's sovereignty and emboldening authoritarian regimes. What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's watch the briefing.
Go toe-to-toe with Vladimir Putin.
Well, if there's I'll take the second question first. If there's anybody in this world that can go toe-to-toe with Putin, that could go toe-to-toe with Xi, that could go toe-to-toe with Kim Jong-un, and we could keep going down the list, it's Donald J. Trump. He is the deal maker in chief. There is no question that he is the commander in chief. And I, for one, and I think all Americans and around the world should have no doubt about his ability to not only handle Putin, but to handle the complexity of driving this war to an end. And then on your first piece on Europe, I'll take you back to 2014. You're right, there was a lot of hand-wringing in Europe and not a lot of action. There's also a lot of hand-wringing here in Washington under the Obama administration and not a lot of action. They literally threw blankets at the problem. And so I'll remind everyone that Putin had some type of conflict, invasion, or issue with their neighbor under President Bush with Georgia, under President Obama with Ukraine 2014, not under President Trump 45, and again with President Biden in 2022. The war should have been deterred. The war should have never happened, and I have no doubt it would not have happened under President Trump and will stop under President Trump again. But I just want to push back on this notion of our European allies not being consulted as we've entered into this process. I already mentioned the immediate phone call President Trump made to President Zelensky. He has talked to President Macron of France repeatedly last week. President Macron convened European leaders and then is coming here on Monday. Prime Minister Starmer is coming next Thursday. I've talked to every one of my national security advisor counterparts across the spectrum in Europe. I've talked to Secretary General Rutte, the leader of NATO, the Secretary General of NATO. We have repeatedly, by the way, we had half our cabinet, 7 cabinet officials, including the vice president, at the Munich Security Conference, all engaging, all listening, and all making sure our allies are heard. However, we've also made it clear for years, decades even, that it is unacceptable that the United States and the United States taxpayer continues to bear the burden, not only of the cost of the war in Ukraine, but of the defense of Europe. We fully support our NATO allies. We fully support the Article 5 commitment, but it's time for our European allies to step up. And one of the things that Secretary General Rutte said on our call was, this last couple of weeks have been a real wake-up call. And I asked him, what have you been missing the last couple of years? The fact that we are going to enter into a NATO summit this June with a third of our NATO allies still not meeting the 2% minimum, a commitment they made a decade ago, literally a decade ago, with a war on their doorstep, the largest war that they're all extremely concerned about, but yet it's, well, somebody else needs to pay. We've got other domestic priorities. It's unacceptable. President Trump's made that clear. And the minimum needs to be met. We need to be at 100% in this June at the NATO summit. And then let's talk about exceeding it, which is what President Trump has been talking about with 5% of GDP. Europe needs to step up for their own defense as a partner, and we can be friends and allies and have those tough conversations.
Great. Peter.
Thank you, Caroline. I have a Ukraine one and a Doge one. Who can talk Doge?
Stephen. Go ahead.
Stephen, I could do Doge then. All of us. Doge then.
Well, so Stephen, we're hearing about these Doge dividend checks that would be 20% back to taxpayers, 20% to pay down the debt, 60% is left. Who gets that?
Well, the way that it works is when you achieve savings, you can either return it to taxpayers, you can return it to our debtors, or it can be cycled into next year's budget, and then it just lowers the overall baseline for next year. So in other words, you can just transfer it into the next fiscal window and then lower the overall spending level. And that means that you can achieve a permanent savings that way, and that reduces the deficit.
And when is it that people might see those checks?
Well, this is all going to be worked on through the reconciliation process with Congress that's going underway right now. As you've seen, the Senate's moving a bill, the House is moving a bill. The President has great confidence in both chambers to deliver on his priorities. I would just take this opportunity to note that President Trump has made a historic commitment to the working class of this country to fight for major tax relief and major price relief. And cutting spending, as Doge is doing, and cutting taxes is the key to delivering on both of those promises, and President Trump is resolutely committed to doing both.
Thank you. And on Ukraine, I guess this is for Mike.
Sure.
After the president's post on Truth Social yesterday, need to know, who does he think is more responsible for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin or Zelensky?
Well, look, his goal, Peter, is to bring this war to an end, period. And there has been ongoing fighting on both sides. It is World War I style trench warfare. His frustration with President Zelensky is that you've heard is multifold. One, there needs to be a deep appreciation for what the American people, what the American taxpayer, what President Trump did in his first term, and what we've done since. So some of the rhetoric coming out of Kyiv, frankly, and insults to President Trump were unacceptable, number one. Number two, our own Secretary of Treasury personally made the trip to offer the Ukrainians what can only be described as a historic opportunity. That is for America to co-invest with Ukraine in their minerals, in their resources, to truly grow the pie. So case in point, there's a foundry that processes aluminum in Ukraine. It's been damaged. It's not at its current capacity. If that is restored, it would account for America's entire imports of aluminum for an entire year. That one foundry. There are tremendous resources there. Not only is that long-term security for Ukraine, not only do we help them grow the pie with investments, but we do have an obligation to the American taxpayer in helping them recoup the hundreds of billions that have occurred. So, rather than enter into some constructive conversations about what that deal should be going forward, we got a lot of rhetoric in the media that was incredibly unfortunate. And I could just tell you, Peter, as a veteran, as somebody who's been in combat, this war is horrific. And I think we've lost sight of that, of the literally thousands of people that are dying a day, families that are going without the next generation. And I find it kind of, frankly ridiculous. So many people in Washington that were just demanding, pounding the table for a ceasefire in Gaza are suddenly aghast that the president would demand one and both sides come to the table when it comes to Ukraine, a war that has been arguably far greater in scope and scale, and far more dangerous in terms of global escalation to U.S. security.
And I do have one for Caroline. Does President Trump have a bet with Trudeau about this USA-Canada hockey game tonight? And when there is a big hockey game on, Is the president watching for the goals or for the fights?
Probably both. I think he's watching for the United States to win tonight. I know he talked to the USA hockey team this morning. He talked to the players after their morning practice around 10 o'clock. And I also spoke to some folks from that team after. They were jubilant over President Trump's comments to the team. I believe they're going to put out a video of that call. So he looks forward to watching the game tonight, and we look forward to the United States beating our soon-to-be 51st state, Canada. Bloomberg, go ahead.
My question is for Mike Waltz. Can you give us a readout of Kellogg's meeting with Zelensky that just wrapped up? And in particular, Zelensky publicly rejected this deal about the rare earth minerals. Where does that stand?
Well, we're going to continue to have, he needs to come back to the table, and we're going to continue to have discussions about where that deal is going. Again, we have an obligation to the taxpayer. I think this is an opportunity. The president thinks this is an opportunity for Ukraine going forward. There can be, in my view, nothing better for Ukraine's future and for their security than to have the United States invested in their prosperity long term. And then a key piece of this has also been security guarantees. Look, the reality that we're talking about here is it in Ukraine's interest? Is it in Europe's interest? It certainly isn't in Russia's interest or in the American people's interest for this war to grind on forever and ever and ever. So a key part of his conversation was helping President Zelensky understand this war needs to come to an end. This kind of open-ended mantra that we've had under the Biden administration, that's over. And I think a lot of people are having a hard time accepting that. And then the other piece is there's been discussions from Prime Minister Starmer and also President Macron about European-led security guarantees. We welcome that. We've been asking Europe to step up and secure its own prosperity, safety, and security. So we certainly welcome that, and we certainly welcome more European assistance. As I told my counterparts, come to the table with more if you want a bigger seat at the table. And we've been asking for that for quite some time.
And has Russia pushed for sanctions in your talks with them? And have you consulted with international partners and allies about potentially rolling back sanctions in these negotiations to end the war?
The talks with our Russian counterparts, both with my counterpart, the National Security Advisor, Secretary Rubio's counterpart, the Foreign Minister Lavrov, it really was quite broad, focused on what is the goals for our broader relationship, but very clear that the fighting has to stop to get to any of those brighter goals. And as a first step, we're just going to do some common sense things like restore the ability of both of our embassies to function. And again, this is common sense in foreign policy world. They call it shuttle diplomacy. We have to talk to both sides in order to get to both sides to the table, and both sides have said only President Trump could do that.
Deanna.
Thank you. And my question is for Mike Waltz.
All right.
Sorry.
The president has called Zelensky a dictator. Does he view Putin as a dictator? And does he want Zelensky out of power? I know he's called for elections. And then thirdly, the head of the Defense Committee in Ukraine's parliament just has claimed that the U.S. has stopped selling weapons to Ukraine. Is that true?
Well, most of our weapons that have gone to Ukraine have been part of a drawdown authority where we've literally taken them out of our stocks and then eventually through appropriations started buying them again to refill our stocks. I'll just state that there has been a lag in a lot of that process. So many of our stocks, as we look at our operations around the world, are becoming more depleted. That's one of the reasons many people have had a lot of concern about when does this end? How much is it going to take? How many lives will be lost? How much will we spend? As a member of Congress, we repeatedly asked the Biden administration those questions, and we never got a satisfactory answer. Look, President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelensky. The fact that he hasn't come to the table, that he hasn't been willing to take this opportunity that we have offered. I think he eventually will. get to that point, and I hope so very quickly. But President Trump, is, as we made clear to our Russian counterparts, and I want to make clear today, he's focused on stopping the fighting and moving forward. And we could argue all day long about what's happened in the past.
The press secretary's statements regarding Ukraine are misleading and fundamentally flawed. The claim that only President Trump can bring peace ignores the reality that the U.S. and NATO have already been engaged in diplomatic efforts while supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself. There is no evidence that Trump holds any special leverage over Putin. His history of praising authoritarian leaders raises concerns about whose interests he truly prioritizes. Suggesting that Zelensky is equally responsible for the war is dangerously misleading, as it ignores the fact that Russia launched an unprovoked invasion. Framing negotiations as a way to force Ukraine into concessions effectively rewards Putin's aggression and sets a dangerous precedent. The assertion that the U.S. is carrying too much of the burden is also false, as European nations have already contributed billions in aid, in some cases surpassing U.S. contributions. Supporting Ukraine is not just an act of goodwill. It is a strategic investment in global security, preventing further Russian expansion that could threaten NATO allies and ultimately drag the U.S. into larger conflicts. The suggestion that Zelensky is a dictator is an absurd false equivalency. Ukraine remains a democracy with free elections, an independent judiciary, and a free press, while Putin jails opposition leaders, censors media, and rigs elections. Threatening to withdraw U.S. support unless Europe contributes more is reckless and plays directly into Putin's hands. History has shown that appeasement only emboldens aggressors, and a weakened Ukraine would not end the war. It would only encourage further Russian expansion. The administration's stance on Ukraine is not about securing peace, but about justifying the withdrawal of support, even if it means sacrificing a democratic ally and undermining long-term U.S. strategic interests.